All right, well, good afternoon and welcome to the first of our spring 2016 Politics and Pizza Roundtable discussion sessions. My name's Eric Austin. I am a member of the political science faculty here at MSU, and I'm also the executive director of the Wheeler Center. These Politics and Pizza events are co-produced and in collaboration with the political science department and the Wheeler Center. I want to try and get to our conversation as quickly as I can this afternoon, but I do need to thank both the Wheeler Center and the department, the Political Science Department, for supporting the series of events. This is the first of 3 that will take place this spring. And I also want to acknowledge the College of Letters and Science, as well as the university, for their backing of discussion events like this and others that give us the opportunity to have some conversations about important current events, both with students and with the wider community as well. So thank you for taking part. Thanks for coming this afternoon. I am joined by 3 panelists this afternoon, 4 of us total. To my immediate right is Jerry Johnson. Jerry is a member of the political science department here as well as a professor of political science. Earned his doctorate from Idaho State University, teaches natural resources policy as well as administrative law, both of which are sort of critical components of thinking about public lands and federal lands management, which is our topic this afternoon. Jerry's been doing research on the political economy of the New West, and so amenity economics, natural resources policy. Most recently edited a book called Knowing Yellowstone: Science in America's First National Park. Is currently doing research on decision-making in public lands, risky environments, so particularly in avalanche settings, but other environments as well. And brings many years of experience to the conversation this afternoon. To Jerry's right is Mason Auger. Mason is a graduate, earned his doctorate from the University of Colorado, is a human geographer, is working here in the Earth Sciences Department, and is working on a research project looking at ways of helping preserve grassland health, so working with landowners in identifying ways to work to help those environments maintain their health and viability. And then finally, at the far end of the table, we're joined by Whitney Tilt. Whitney is the Director of Land and Wildlife Conservation for the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation. And is working with the Mountain Sky Guest Ranch, which is over in Emigrant in the Paradise Valley, in addressing larger natural resource issues in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Whitney's career has focused largely on conservation and has worked on a range of natural resources issues, from Colorado River water allocations, the black-footed ferret recovery efforts, as well as Asian tiger conservation efforts, and has also been involved in evaluating federal fisheries program. He's worked with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the Sonoran Institute, and the National Audubon Society. He earned his master's degree in environmental science from the Yale School of Forestry, and sort of a little bit of an aside about the Yale School of Forestry that kind of fits nicely here. It was the first school of forestry in the United States, as I understand it, and was established by Gifford Pinchot, who is also given credit for establishing the U.S. Forest Service. So long history in public lands and federal lands management there. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to spend a few minutes talking a little bit about their perspective and understanding of some of the issues associated with public and federal lands management, particularly, especially in the aftermath of the Malheur wildlife refuge occupation that just ended in the last couple of days. So, Jerry, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Oh, good. First.
All right.
Well, my first sentence on this thing is, let's clear up some nonsense. The Malheur takeover, Occupy movement was precipitated by a father and son who were arrested for arson. They started a backfire on their property. Some of that fire spread to federal land. They were prosecuted by a federal district judge, found guilty, given a minimum sentence, but a very probably overzealous federal prosecutor in Washington, D.C., whose charge was to prosecute people under terrorism laws, appealed that case. And the Hammonds end up being convicted on appeal with a mandatory minimum sentence of, I think it was 5 years, something like that. So the Cowboys ride to their rescue, of course, and that's what the occupation is all about. But for a moment, just think a little bit about how the Hammonds were prosecuted as terrorists. They're not terrorists, all right? That's really important to keep in mind. This is really symptomatic of a whole bunch of other, this really complex mosaic of politics. And somehow, this wildlife refuge in empty part of Oregon gets folded into international terrorism prosecution. This is crazy, right? This is crazy. And this is the kind of thing, this really is government overreach to its citizens with very sad results, right? So I just want to make that point. The terrorism word is thrown around with this thing. These guys aren't terrorists. They burned some sagebrush, and I don't think that was going to threaten the national security of the United States. When the Cowboys come to the rescue, Emmett Bundy and his crew, the other point that needs to be made is they weren't invited. They weren't wanted. In fact, a lot of people in Burns and Hammonds themselves said, "Go away, we don't need you here." But there's, again, a political agenda associated with this, that the Bundys and these anti-government grazing cowboys see an opening here, a strategic opening to make a stand, right? And we were talking before this thing started, I think it was a bad strategic choice of location because it is so isolated, because it basically garners no attention. It sets them up for exactly what happened. The third thing that I find really interesting are the fringe groups that came sort of right behind the Cowboys, right? And these were the gun crazies. These are the people that we saw on the media mostly, in their tactical clothing with their tactical weapons, drawing beads on federal officers. This again is another layer of political agenda. They see an opening, right? And an opening to, one, live out their strange gun fantasies, and two, a way to make again this anti-government statement, right? The last thing. There's nothing new to see here, right? When I was an undergraduate at Idaho State, and in an ecology program where our field camp was at Malheur, our summer field camp was there, we studied the Sagebrush Rebellion. This was back in the dark ages, before the internet, before email. This is in the early 70s. The history of the West, we have these sorts of movements that crop up, and we don't need to go through all of them. Montana's enjoyed its fair share of these anti-government movements with the militia of Montana and the Patriots, and it seems like every time you turn around with a different decade, there's another anti-government movement. When I first came to Bozeman, I'll just finish with this story. When I first came to Bozeman, there was a guy who was arrested out in the Belgrade post office. The post office, it's a federal building. He drove there on state roads and was arrested for for having a hand-carved license plate because he didn't support the American government. Now he's willing to, live on their subsidies, he's willing to drive on their roads, and he's willing to collect his mail from a federal post office, but he can't be bothered to cough up a little bit to license his car as a protest. There's nothing logical about this movement, these movements. These are purely small, concentrated, isolated political events that happen. There's nothing new about this Malheur occupation. This is not a thing. These are a small group of people, both the cowboys that came to their rescue and the gun people, the so-called militia people that followed him. This is not a thing. This is not a wave. This is not something we need to be overly concerned about, except with respect to monitoring it. So, there's my little 2 cents worth to get us started. Okay.
So just a couple of anecdotes to get my comments started. 15 years ago, I was working for the Forest Service just as a seasonal employee, and I was working in Northeast Nevada, based out of Elko, Nevada at this time. And when I showed up there in late May, it must have been probably the first week of June, second week. Anyway, I was just getting the lay of the land, and people were filling me in, and several Forest Service employees were talking about this sagebrush rebellion, and I'd never heard of it. I didn't know what they were talking about, and they had mentioned something that had happened up in the Jarbidge. I didn't know where the Jarbidge was. Elko, actually you can see on the map over here, you see the Ruby Mountains there. If you look in Nevada, the Rubies, Elko sits at the sort of northeast corner. And then if you go further northeast, almost to Idaho, that's where the Jarbidge is. And the Jarbidge is a strange place. Elko is typical Nevada basin and range country, but you get to Jarbidge, it's 50 miles of dirt road just to get to Jarbidge. And it's unlike the rest of the country around it. If somebody helicoptered you in there, you would think maybe you were in Colorado or the high country of Montana even. It does not seem like Nevada at all. It's beautiful. In any case, I didn't think much of it. Later in the summer, me and a coworker had to go up into the Jarbidge to do some work, and our boss said something to the effect of, all right, you got to go up there, just, be careful, mind your P's and Q's, don't antagonize anybody. And we didn't, and everything was fine. But I'll just show you a picture. This is from an op-ed, which I just lost it. There it is. About Malheur, and this is from a professor down at Wyoming that wrote this op-ed, and this is Jarbidge in 2000. So what that was all about was the Forest Service had closed an access road, and the locals took offense. They used that road it wasn't a road to get to town or anything like that. It was just the road that they'd come to use over the years to picnic, to hunt, to fish, to do whatever. And so they removed this rock. So that was 15 years ago. That was my first exposure to this stuff. And then a few weeks ago, I was up in northern Montana doing some research, and I stopped by a BLM office to talk to a couple people there concerning the research. And when I went in, this was the morning after the shooting, when that gentleman was killed by I think, FBI agents. So I went in the office, and there were several people standing around, and they all looked at me really strangely. I could sense something immediately, but I didn't know what. And so as I walked up to the desk, one gentleman said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm here to see the two people I was here to see." And the door was closed. They went into the recesses of the BLM office, and I see a law enforcement officer poking his head out of the window, looking at me very suspiciously. And I was, what is going on? Anyway, he went and got the people, and as he came back, he said, "Oh, sorry about that. You were making us nervous. You have a beard. You were wearing flannel." And this was the day after the shooting, and so BLM officers and Fish and Wildlife officers apparently were on high alert. And they were, I guess, momentarily worried that I was part of this movement. So I've crossed paths with these issues over time, and I've studied a little bit. I guess the thing I want to point out is, like Jerry was saying, these issues flare up from time to time, and they have a long history, well over 100 years or more, I'd say, depending on how far back you want to track it. The point I would make is these issues, structurally speaking, I think you can find similarities across time and space with these things. But if you look at each individual place or the particular geographies where these flare up, there are particular issues that are unique to each place. So I'll give you one example, which doesn't exactly fit in there for this, but it's similar, which is northern New Mexico, where I lived for a time around Taos in this area. There's a lot of federal land there, a lot of Forest Service land, a few national monuments and whatnot. There is quite a bit of antagonism between the local community and federal land managers or agencies in that area. And primarily that antagonism is between the native, what they called native community, not Native Americans, but Native Latinos. So they see themselves as New Mexicans. And these people can date their tenure on the land for hundreds and hundreds of years, well before the formation of the United States and well before the United States captured those lands from Mexico in the Mexican-American War. And that antagonism flares up from time to time, and that is based around subsistence use of resources. So once the Forest Service sort of established a presence in that area and began to harvest timber, increasingly the Forest Service exerted more and more control over those lands, and for local people, they felt as though they were given less and less access. And so they've protested. There was a big flare-up in the late 60s, early 70s, and there's flare-ups from time to time. Quite a different situation. Nevertheless, there are some similarities there. So I just want to point out that these things can be particular to local areas, even though the dynamic can be quite similar, which is the big dynamic here is local, global, local, federal, however you want to frame that. The sense in which the federal government controls these lands from a distance and is not responsive to local needs and concerns. In any case, that is how it's often, that's the complaints that are often made. I don't know. I guess I'll leave it at that.
Well, I'd like to add a little bit more in the way of context. And I think Jerry's observations that we're talking about small and isolated is very much part of that context. But when you think of Oregon, you probably think of Portland, you think of a lot of trees, you think of Bozeman being compared repeatedly to Bend. You think of amenities, you think of fairly big populations, and then you think of this family shows up from somewhere in Nevada, from the southeastern corner of Nevada. Why the hell did they pick Malheur? Well, this first picture gives you a very good indication of at least one thought, and that is they're much more similar than, say, Bend or Burns is of Portland or Bend. The Bundys came from their homes in southeast Nevada, traveled through the Great Basin. They left a place that was high and dry and went to a place that was high and dry. Both are sparsely populated. Both are very much dominated, and by dominated, truly dominated by federal land ownership. So high and dry, very sparsely populated as much today as 50 to 100 years ago. Many of the counties in this area have less people today than they did 100 years ago. Patrick, if we could scroll down, this puts the context of federal lands into east versus west, and then even in the west, all lands are not equal. But this is that area west of the 100th meridian where the rain was supposed to follow the plow. It didn't quite work out that way. In our state, we have really a relatively low, what is that, 30% there? Oregon has 52%, and it's really dominated in two areas, the O and C areas that we'll get to when we see Oregon, and then the Bureau of Land Management that got all the lands after anybody who had possibly any interest, even after the Park Service or the refuge system or all that got it. Anything left in the public domain went to the Bureau of Land Management. And back then it was basically a lot of desert, a lot of sagebrush, and all that. So anyway, very high ownership of federal lands. So if we go to the next one, we now see that context in the state of Oregon. So as you probably know, the green is Forest Service, the dark green is wilderness, the brown is the Bureau of Land Management, and the refuge system, which I've worked with for years and actually started my career long before any of you were born. In the national, my first job was with a national wildlife refuge for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But you see, and Patrick, are you circling around where Malheur is? That's all Bureau of Land Management, and inside of it, there's this tiny little sliver managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The refuge came before the Bureau of Land Management was even formed. It was created by Teddy Roosevelt, who's, along with Gifford Pinchot, would form the Forest Service and do many things, but there wasn't even a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service there, but he did create a refuge. Not for high desert, not for sagebrush, but for the water that was there. It was created for migratory waterfowl. Specifically, it's part of the Pacific Flyway and trumpeter swans and the like. So here you are in the middle of nowhere at a time in, I think it was 1908, where nobody cared about this area, and they created a National Wildlife Refuge, or what would become the National Wildlife Refuge. To the west, you have the other experience of Oregon with the BLM, and those are called the O and C lands. Along the coast, you have a creation that was all timber reserves. So this is the breadbasket for the timber industry. Interestingly enough, Burns also used to be largely driven by timber, and that timber industry has dried up. So here are these contexts: very high federal lands, very remote areas that the only people who cared about Malheur when it was created as a National Wildlife Refuge were a bunch of birders that were trying to prevent the millinery trade from wiping out every single wading bird and waterfowl, for which they've been remarkably successful. It was funded by hunters in the National Wildlife Refuge system that now numbers over 150 such places. But it's probably of everything that in the Federal Reserve, it's one of the least known. You have this sense that it's in Oregon, but it's really has much more to do with the barrens of the same sort of high desert areas of Nevada and Utah than it does with downtown Portland. So why pick a National Wildlife Refuge? Well, first of all, Burns is a center of ranching. It's a depressed economy. It's still reeling from the loss of timber. Jerry already mentioned the Hammonds, who were really, I agree with him, were kind of made scapegoats by a zealous person from far, far away. And they became a talisman. The interesting thing is, so Jerry raised a question we should talk about. Did they choose the right place? Well, I'd like to think They came thinking they were going to find a lot of sympathy. They thought they were going to work into Burns. They could take over a bunch of a little bit of a refuge. Patrick, go to the last one just so you can see what a crazy place Malheur is as far as an administration. So there, the dark orange is the refuge. For all intents and purposes, the other orange is BLM. And then the town of Burns is to the north off the map. But the original refuge followed the water, and the BLM got everything else. So they came up to a spot they thought would be just like us. They would find a lot of residents. We have these two guys have been thrown in jail for very unjust reasons, and we'll get a bunch of people to tear up their grazing permits. And never mind if they've been mortgaged to the bank using them or anything. None of those were concerns. So I think they picked a spot because they thought with 24/7 news, you can go to a tiny isolated spot and get a camera put on you very quickly. The last piece I'll just add that has not gotten a lot is why these particular people feel so strongly about that. You'll always see them, almost always, they have a copy of the U.S. Constitution in their pocket. They are strict constructionalists. In the case of the family, they are fundamentalist Mormons, and they believe that the U.S. government is not a legal entity. And that's an important context. So those of you who follow the High Country News will recognize this is a picture, and instead of the soldier's name on it, it says U.S. Patriot. But the part that I point to is they would suggest this isn't a continuation of the Sagebrush Rebellion, which had commissioners pulling rocks out of local roads that were restricting their constituents from what they thought was lawful use. These are someone who we should throw on the table as potentially being insurgents. And the difference is insurgents are basically raising an armed rebellion against the very political system that a country is based on. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back.
Okay, so we've got lots of material to work through here a little bit, or to talk through a little bit more. And I guess maybe the question that I would use to kick that off is to basically raise the question of how different are things, right? So you mentioned maybe this is not the same as the Sagebrush Rebellion, that in fact at least a portion of the response, or some members of the response, the folks that have shown up in Burns, actually have a very different objective, or a very different set of questions and concerns. Rather than just conflict over the public land, it's a categorical concern with the legitimacy of the American government and the American state. And there's another difference, I think, that I would raise here a little bit as well, which is this historical change in thinking about use, and how important this might be. Wherein, I think the history of the BLM is a good example of this. Starting with a focus on certainly grazing and ranching, but primarily cattle, contention with sheep ranchers, slowly over time, the addition of other uses, other interests. I think to a large degree, really not until the 60s, but certainly evolving over time. And growing contention over the diversity of potential uses, right? The Bundys become involved or become concerned when they lose access to grazing land because of the desert tortoise. And so there are other pressures, other cultural uses. And so I'm wondering how much that matters in this dynamic, and if that's going to continue to push things, or if there are other factors, whether it's the sort of legitimacy of the American government or what. So how do we make sense of the balance of some of those? What are the connections?
Well, I mean, what Jerry's said earlier, how he characterized it. As it was unfolding, I was following it haphazardly. And then when you asked for me to participate in this, I started reading a little more closely. And from what I understand, I tend to agree with Jerry from what I've seen in the media anyway, in various sources, is that you had three groups is probably not the right word, but three sort of impetuses. One was this sort of long-standing antagonism to the federal government from local rural communities in the West. The next, I think, was this sort of what you're referring to as militia types, which would be the sort of Second Amendment absolutist. I think those people were drawn to this and are drawn to sort of the what used to be called the Sagebrush Rebellion or the Wise Use movement. And, you know, they intersect in certain ways. And then the last, which you mentioned, and I think it has to be considered, is at least for the Bundys and for the man that was killed, Finsicum, there was religious belief that was tied into this. Now, it becomes political because some of these, from what I've seen, some of these religious beliefs held by the Bundys, or perhaps Finsicum, was tied in with sort of the political stance that the United States government is not legitimate, that its power is not legitimate, especially in these local Western lands. So those are the three sort of forces or factors that I see playing into this particular moment. Will these things continue? Probably. I just think there's a long history in the West of a certain amount of antagonism to federal ownership of lands out here. So is it a huge problem? Not in my experience in both working out here in the West and doing research. Most folks, and I'm talking about ranchers in particular, but other constituencies, you mentioned timber industry, there's people who can no longer work in those extractive industries. Most folks have some sort of irritation with federal control of the lands, but they're not militants.
Yeah, I think that's, so if I ask the group here, was this a victory or a loss to democracy and our civil society? I would argue that it was a victory. Our freedom of speech was protected. We had to listen to a lot of people we didn't necessarily want to listen to. But of course, we could turn on a presidential debate and get that. The federal government used in probably excessive leniency in not wanting to repeat a Ruby Ridge type event. And ultimately, except for the one person who, why when you're being surrounded by armed agents and they know you're armed, you would, after putting your hands up, repeatedly go for your waistband. He's no longer with us to explain that action. But most importantly was, how did the community of Burns respond? So the call was for all these ranchers to tear up their grazing leases as a show of how illegal they are, and they'd continue to run their cattle on public lands. The only person they found came from New Mexico. They were hoping for a huge backlash against the imprisonment, and pretty soon after the occupation, they couldn't find any local support. You couldn't even find someone to sponsor a room for them. Lastly, you have the wonderful part of our zany society where you had the bird watchers coming out and demonstrating against them, showing up signs of cookies they should be making and brandishing rolling pins. Because in fact, the economy of Burns, many of the small businesses and all, rely on that refuge, rely on those public lands. So in fact, we saw a great deal of support for the very things the Bundys came to town to demolish. And I think that's good news. So
does that mean then that, as Jerry suggested at the outset, that the strategy for the segment of the population that really is driving these actions is simply to monitor them, and then with the communities that are actually engaged in running their cattle or what extractive industries are still there, work through the issues, as agencies have done more or less effectively over time. Is it sort of, business as usual, or are there strategies to help in the long run mitigate what in some instances is pretty profound distrust, pretty profound differences of understanding of legitimacy and so forth? Are there inroads into those communities, into those populations?
The one distinction I think is important, and this is from the ranching community, is that there are ranchers right now who are legally part of the system that they may not like. They see their AUMs, their animal unit months, being reduced. They see a federal agency increasingly caring more about birds and bees and things like that than helping them make a living. But they pay their annual fees.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Clive Bundy is in arrears of several $1 million. And to ranchers, I sit on the Western Montana Resource Advisory Committee with the BLM. And 2 years ago, when we had a meeting shortly after this had hit the news, one of the ranchers asked, as you know, resource advisory committees are made up of stakeholders. So there are X number of people from the extractive industries, X number from the environmental, and a bunch from the at-large category. And the rancher asked if he the chairman, if he could just make a statement. And you thought, well, what's going to come? This was a traditional rancher from the Dillon area. And he said, I just want to make sure everybody knows that Clive Bundy does not represent me or any rancher I know. Because we pay our fees, we apply to the law, and when we have a grievance, we bring it up through existing channels. So, again, I think it's an important context that most people who are in the ranching community and all do not necessarily look to these guys as their bellwethers.
Well, and that's why it's important to understand the mosaic. Ranchers, it's not the ranchers that are the problem. It's the Bundys and their group. There really is this fundamentalist Mormon and Christian patriot movement among those people. Having spent a lot of time in Utah and not in the polygamous community or part of the polygamous community, but around it. Growing up in Idaho, where we have our fair share of Mormon polygamists up in the top of the panhandle, it really is a subculture of a subculture. And they really are, they intensely believe that they can step outside the system. That's part of it. And when God's tapping on your shoulder, telling you to behave in a certain way, you get behaviors that stem from that. But that third layer, the layer I think that is of concern, who you're never going to get to the table, are the militia people. And I think they're mostly fake militia people. I think it's mostly this Walter Mitty kind of thing, but it doesn't take too many Walter Mitties to pull a trigger and kill a federal agent or somebody else, and that's going to be the downside of this. It's going to tarnish the rancher community who doesn't believe part of this, and most rural people, because whether you really understand it or not, most of America who does not live in a rural area looks at the guns sitting in your gun rack in the back of your Ford and thinks you're semi-insane, right? Most of America doesn't get that. So they lump rural people like those of us in Montana and these militia types into, there's no difference. And of course we all know there is a little bit of a difference, for the most part. Right? But let me get back to this idea. Let me read you something. Federal management of the West resources has been disastrous for decades. Of the nearly 250 million acres controlled by the BLM, most is best suited for grazing and mineral production. Of the nearly 200 million acres controlled by the Forest Service, most is best suited for well-managed timber production. The argument is that the commodity production lands could and should be turned over to the states, if not privatized. That came from an editorial in the New York Times. This is the kind of political leader. Now, this is a pretty neutral statement, and I happen to know the guy who made this neutral statement. He lives here in Bozeman. And I think he believes this. Let me give you a couple other statistics. There's 20,000 grazing leases in all this BLM land. Very small number. They're measured by AUMs, animal unit month, which is a cow-calf, what it takes to, you pay roughly in this part of the world $1.20 to run that cow-calf for a month on BLM land. This BLM land is most suited for grazing. Then why is only 70% of the AUMs utilized? This is the government's fault? That ranchers are not utilizing the total production value of their public lands? I don't think that's the government's fault. I think that tells you something about ranching on these high desert lands where you need several hundred acres to raise a cow. All right? That's why they turn them out in the desert and go collect them at the end of the year, because they need so much land to run these things that no one can possibly manage these herds. Well, but public lands are also good for timber production, right? Where do we grow our timber here in Montana? We don't. Where do you grow it in Nevada? You don't. How about Utah? You don't. You grow it in Georgia. That's where we grow timber and produce timber fiber today, right? The public lands in the West, the ones that these guys are revolting about, the management, are underutilized because the markets dictate that it's more efficient to do these things elsewhere. You don't raise cows in Nevada. You raise cows at a feedlot. That's how you make beef. You raise wood in Georgia. That's where it's most efficient. These people are complaining about market forces that in many cases, I think, have left them behind. They're not adaptable. How many of you grew up on a farm and ranch? Nobody in here. What's that tell you? Any of you know somebody who grew up on a farm and ranch? All right.
It's all the same person.
It's all the same. Right. That one person. Go ask your friends who grew up on farm and ranches when they're going back. They aren't. Right? These people are being left behind by global markets. They're being left behind by industrial efficiencies, and they're left behind by their kids. Right? Why are they pissed off? Right? They're pissed off because life isn't turning out the way they thought it would. They've done, and here I'm talking about the Hammonds, and to an extent I think the Bundys. They've done everything they are supposed to be doing, but it's not working out. What are you going to do? I can't blame my neighbor. He's in the same boat I am. Can't blame my kids for leaving. They're my kids. Who's left? Donald Trump and the federal government. Right? And when you have political leaders like Trump and Cruz and others complaining about the federal government, it's sending a signal to these farmers and ranchers who are left behind by this global economy. Here's who you should be angry at. That's the source of this. I really can't blame them too much, and I really can't blame the global markets, but I can blame the politicians that write crap like this in the New York Times and spew the kind of anti-government hate that you see on CNN and in this, particularly this election.
Tell us what you really think.
Yeah, well.
And that's a hard point, though. I think it's a complicated point, right? Because there are, I think, lots of us who, I'm an organization theorist. I started out in public lands, natural resources policy, but these days I'm primarily an organization theorist. And so I get how organizations like the BLM function, and am very critical in many instances of how they function poorly. But the reasons for why they function poorly are complicated, right? These are really big organizations. They're very complex. There are myriad policies, some good, some bad, but policy exists for a reason. It doesn't just spontaneously exist for no reason. It may not be great reasons, but it exists for some reason. And the result of that development process is that these are really complicated sorts of entities. And the way that they manage lands are correspondingly complicated. And so understanding that is a difficult thing to do. And so there's reason to be critical of those organizations in many instances, and there's reason to be critical of the policy. Those reasons are very different than the kinds of reasons that I think the Bundys are talking about. And yet, the sort of vitriol and the criticism, the initial criticism, it's hard to distinguish those two. It's just a critique of the organization. It's a critique of the policy. And if we want better policy, we got to understand, well, what drives that in the first place? And that's a much harder thing, I think, to get at. And it is one of the things that, and I think the resource advisory councils are a good example of this, right? That these are groups of people who spend a lot of time understanding what is the BLM doing, and what are the standards and practices or standards and guidelines, and what are the management recommendations, and what are the trade-offs, and all of those kinds of things. They're in a position to understand, or at least begin to understand, the complexity in a way that others don't necessarily. And there's no question necessarily in that, but there is there's a lot of facets. There are a lot of layers to this stuff that make the actual management, actual decision making, actual organizational choices confounding and complicated, but understandable ultimately, with some time associated with that. All right, so let me maybe shift directions here and open the floor to folks in the room and see what kinds of questions you have. So Chris is grabbing the microphone, and if you've got a question, raise your hand. Chris will come find you and give you an opportunity to pose a question.
All right, you guys. Do I turn on this way?
It's on, yeah.
Okay, sorry. So I know, Jerry, you mentioned that this isn't a very widespread movement, but and maybe you guys address this, but I look at the wise use movement as being kind of cousins to this. I know maybe tactics are different, but it does seem to be growing, and through loosely connected maybe to some of the like white male anger we see coming out to support Donald Trump. I mean, I see it as being a little bit more widespread. I was wondering if you could kind of, or anybody on the panel could kind of speak to that a little bit. And if you guys want, maybe go into that, paying more attention to white male anger in the national political spectrum. If this was a bunch of black kids taking over a federal building, would the response be the same? Would the media treatment be the same? I mean, it wouldn't be, but was there special attention paid, do you think, because of the election coming up? Two long questions.
I think it looks really widespread because if you look at the map up here, there's a lot of geography. The 24-hour news cycle. Yeah, I can get on TV, I can get on CNN by doing just about anything a little bit outrageous, right? Because they need content. So when these kind of events crop up, yeah, they're going to get covered by the news. But look at the total population of the western states. Clip out the urban centers where where this is not happening. Just reserve the rural areas. You're talking about literally a handful of people. Jordan, Montana, that looked like a big Christian patriot movement. Ever been to Jordan? It can't really host a very big movement out there. So I think the footprint looks large. Southern Poverty Law Center maps it out. It looks large. But I think you're still talking about just such a small number of people who are largely misunderstood by most of America. Not in a good way, but they just don't get it because most of America will never see how cows are grown in the Nevada desert. Yeah.
I think to your point on the wise use movement, there has been a disconnect between the federal government and the people who live in those areas. Now, the refuge manager of Malheur in 1960, I promise you, was a white male and came up through an ag college and had grown up at least hunting and trapping and probably shooting the very waterfowl he was now in charge of protecting. In fact, refuges do allow hunting. That person is no longer, I can't remember who the refuge manager is, but I can promise you they probably didn't grow up on a farm or a ranch. They didn't raise their hand either. And so there has been this disconnect between the federal managers and the people who are in the communities that are directly affected. You don't have to go to Burns, Oregon. You can go right to Bozeman, Montana, and think of how bison issues, wolf issues, timber issues, wilderness issues are discussed. And the person in Times Square who wants to save a wolf has the exact same voice as someone in immigrant Montana that is actually losing livestock to wolves and then finding that the promised compensation is nowhere to be found. So that person actually has to live with them, has probably lost not their child, they're not really worried about that, but they are worried about Fido, because wolves love to eat their dogs, and they are really worried about when a $400 to $2,000 animal goes missing. So this disconnect that the wise use movement really rose and that we'll see continuing from the commissioners and all that. We had our own road closing in Bear Canyon that still sticks. The Bear Canyon right here, that was very reminiscent of this picture that we have here. So those are all issues that were kind of coined under the wise use. Are we doing the right thing? And there's a very natural feeling of anger when you don't feel you can control your own backyard. So I think that will continue. I would like to think, even past the election cycle, that we would have a lot less of this. This is an absolute failure for the people who thought this was really going to resonate and accomplish. Will they still grab headlines the next time? Absolutely, as long as you watch the stuff. As long as we watch it, there's a market for it. So again, I think this is a radical sect of a natural outgrowth of the feeling that you aren't in control of your life. I think both of you mentioned that.
I would address your question in this way. This is, especially with the Malheur incident, it's not, I was going to say that it's not coherent, and in many ways I don't think it is coherent, but I think what I mean to say is it's this phenomena you're addressing with your question, it is not homogeneous. So, and what I mean by that is one way to think of this in terms of what you're saying is, isn't it more widespread than perhaps you guys are giving credence to? And I tend to agree with Jerry. I don't think it is. However, there's different, I'm a geographer, so it helps me to think of scale. So what's happening on the ground at Malheur is one thing. What's happening in this editorial that you quoted from the New York Times is another thing. They're related, but they're different. What's happening with, say, various representatives from western states, whether they be Idaho, Montana, Nevada, in Congress, and who they're interacting with in terms of powerful interests in Congress is another thing. And these things intersect. They come together. However, they're happening at different scales. So my sense of that is there some groundswell of militant anti-federal government anger that is about to sweep the West? No, not at all. However, there are interests represented, I think, for example, with this editorial that was quoted, that are pushing and have been for a long time and are connected with wise use, pushing for privatization of federal lands. Now those,
or state control.
Or state control. Those interests often line up with perhaps some of the folks that showed up at the refuge. In many ways, I believe their interests don't line up. However, the rhetoric, the ideology seems to match, so they can make decent bedfellows. So I think one way to think about this is there's forces at work that are operating at different scales, and my sense of that this may be more widespread, I think that's happening at the discursive level or the ideological level, not so much at this local sort of protest movement level.
And let me just add a quick note on the question of ticked off white males. I promise you, if you went to Burns or to any public meeting, if you think ticked off white males are dangerous, go see the ticked off white women that are right behind them or often in front of them, who are often even scarier and probably as good with firearms, if not better. So I do think this seemed to be all male. But if you got into these ranching communities in these areas where you see this sort of anger, it is not restricted to, it's probably restricted to whites because they are the residents of these areas by and large, but they're hardly male dominated. You can find plenty of ticked off women.
Well, the leader of the Wise Youth movement was Karen Budd, she's a very smart woman, had that law degree and ran with it. And she almost single-handedly ran that movement.
Got a lot of people elected.
So let me ask maybe sort of a follow-up question. So if much of what we've been talking about is sort of a fringe movement here, there is still, I think, what sounds like, because of this disconnect, a larger, probably more sustainable set of concerns about the disconnect between federal management from the DC office and what happens on the land here, whether it's wolf management or AUMs and the cost and all of those kinds of questions. I think, I think it's still true that just about every session of Congress, one of the Wyoming delegation introduces legislation in Congress to try and return the federal lands to state control, or turn federal lands, not return, but turn to federal lands to state control. There are certainly a lot of folks, I think, who see state control or local control as being code for no control. So where does that rank in terms of how concerned we should be? Is that a realistic possibility? Is it political? Is it symbolic politics? Does it matter?
Potentially. I guess that's how it is. Yeah, I think potentially it matters. I don't follow the ins and outs of those machinations in Washington, so perhaps you guys know better, but it seems to me that is an angle that certain interests, they're not quitting. They're finding different ways to sort of push that agenda, so potentially.
I spent 18 years in the Puzzle Palace. And I will say this, that you do have to ask the question that has been raised by many Western legislatures, that if you really are so interested in having wolves, then you let them out in your backyard. So the state of Wyoming was just mentioned. The state of Wyoming allowed wolves to come into Yellowstone with a clear understanding that they would be allowed in the Shoshone and the park, which is all part of Yellowstone, Wyoming generally, and that they made it very clear in the rest of the state it is a listed predator, meaning that any livestock must be compensated by the state without any kind of filings or anything. So they said, you guys go ahead with it. You got the national forest lands of the Shoshone and the park. Everybody agreed. Wolves were let out, terribly successful. They didn't even have to go to the third release. And now, for the last 3 years, we've heard how the state of Wyoming had foisted upon us an illegal wolf plan that was accepted when the wolves were let out. So you can see the frustration of people like the state residents of Wyoming and all when it comes to the constantly changing kind of playing field. And we see it in Montana. There's no sense picking on Wyoming. But when you see people like from the state of New York, how many congressmen do we have in the state of Montana? one, at large. How many at-large states still exist? How many congressmen in California? I don't know the answer, but a lot. How many in New York? A lot. And they're the ones that will vote to dictate how management is in the state of Montana. Is that fair? Can they foist on us stuff that they would not foist on themselves? So that's not, I don't have an answer to that, but you can see where there's a natural tension and this kind of idea of, if you come and mess up my backyard, I'm gonna come mess up your backyard. It used to be that Congress wouldn't dictate something in another member's backyard without their consent. That seems to be no longer the case because they're playing on a much bigger stage. So there's a lot of natural reason for this. But I think, again, the good news is it's played out with angry words and a lot of gestures, but very seldom does it go to even the level of discourse or civility, is that a word? I don't think so, that we see even within the presidential debates. So day in and day out, these things are brought up, they're slammed on the table, this isn't right, but generally speaking, it's worked out among a democratic process. So I think that's really important.
And Montana, at the same time, conveniently forgets that for every dollar we send to DC, we get $2.54 back. So, in a way, we're kind of being paid to host these wolves. And they're worth about $70 million a year in tourism revenue. So, it's real easy to criticize, and I agree. And I think the way that the wolves were reintroduced was very hard on these western states. And it's really easy to criticize the federal government for behaving that way. But let's remember the public trough that we all have our snouts and our trotters in, right? We're getting fat and happy on federal dollars. I collected a couple numbers here on fires because you asked about the state control. Let me just give you a couple numbers. Montana does something that a lot of western states don't do. We have a savings account for fires. Right now we have about $86 million in it. And we're very proud of ourselves. Over 10 years, we've amassed this pile of money to fight fires. Estimated costs related to home protection for all agencies in 2007 was about between $55 and $36 million. All right. If current trends continue, over half the Forest Service budget will be spent just fighting fires. Does anyone know what the Forest Service budget is? It's $5 billion. Do the math. How long is that $86 million going to last the state of Montana when we take over these federal lands? I didn't do the math, but I think it's about 30 minutes. Right? And we haven't had big fires in this state. So again, it's real easy to say as a politician or somebody running for president, these lands should be given back to the states. If you want to bankrupt the western states, by all means, give us the federal lands. We won't last a year with them. I kind of look at this sort of thing as some things make good politics, but some things, again, are just nonsense. And this rhetoric about states managing federal lands is just nonsense. It's a non-starter. And I think there's enough smart people in Washington, D.C. That they get that. There's apparently, strangely enough smart people in the state of Utah that they just turned down that initiative. They were going to spend $100,000 of money in the state of Utah to study taking over federal lands, and it was just defeated in their legislature. So, again, the rhetoric isn't always matched with the performance, and you got to hand it to the state of Utah for, having some political leadership there that shot that down.
But Utah's had a firsthand experience with, so one of the things that annoys the western states greatly is when a president names a national monument. Mm-hmm. And so I guess it would have been Clinton, named Grand Staircase Escalante over the huge objection of the commissioners and all. And this is where a lot of the incidents that were in the wise use movement occurred. You go down there now, you won't hear too many people saying bad things about the National Monument, because now they've come to realize that in fact does bring an economic revival. But no one ever likes being told what to do versus being invited in, and yet without that declaration, it's doubtful that they would have gotten there on their own. So.
All right, I think we've got time for one last question if there's one out there.
My question is, would there, one second, I wrote it down. Sorry about this. Do y'all think we should have more or less BML land? And do you think if more or less, would it spark more like outbreaks of like people being angry at the government, or less of those kind of outbreaks?
I think very clearly there needs to be less. I would disagree. If we could have a process where we evaluated federal lands, remember I started my comments saying that BLM got everything that was left over that nobody wanted. So these are not all beautifully, they were not picked by a committee looking for productive lands. And they're very expensive to manage properly. And so we either as a society give these agencies like the BLM decent resources to manage them, or I think they should be considered. Right now, the BLM, all the federal agencies are asking to do with less every year. You don't have to go any further than the forest in our backyard. Jerry's brought up a very good point that over 60% of the Forest Service's budget will go to a bad fire year, and that is not from a fire fund. That goes into their money that was going to go to managing the lands, keeping their campgrounds open, etc. So there's a real disparity, and we really probably should look at, could the BLM be a more effective agency if they actually had control? The BLM, as a rule, will not seek additional acquisitions except where it's strategic, and those would be within their national conservation lands and other areas that are really valuable. But I think a lot of people would be almost better if, there have been national wildlife refuges that have been deauthorized because they were kind of a political punt to begin with, and all of a sudden, well, in the case of the one outside of Pyramid Lake, it ceased to exist when the Bureau of Reclamation built a dam that then took the water away from the refuge, so it didn't cease to exist, and so it went away. But I do think as a rule, we should have, to answer your question directly from my standpoint, the BLM does not need more land than it already has. It needs to have the ability to manage more strategically what it has, and perhaps to resort some of what it has.
Here's the classic academic reply. It's the wrong question. How's that? It's the wrong question because it's a moot point. If you look at the federal budget and you look at the entitlement programs that are earmarked to take care of old people like us when we're old and frail, and you're going to pay for it, there simply isn't enough money to go around, and there's not going to be enough money to go around. And what's going to give BLM lands, national parks, national forests, these places that are potentially super valuable to the United States, but have such a small constituency compared to military budgets and welfare budgets and education budgets. The one, because there's a wonderful example here in Montana, the one really great solution to your question is the American Prairie Reserve. And I think that is a model, whether we form a nonprofit and let a nonprofit use market forces to build what's essentially a prairie-based Yellowstone National Park, or you put some of these public lands into public trusts and let local knowledgeable people manage them for some purpose. I think we've got to we can't be thinking about expansion. We got to be thinking about creative management at a much more efficient level. there are no more lands, I don't think, to
I don't
expand
think we're making
to.
any more, no.
I mean, projects like yours are the future. You know, you take wealthy landowners and hire professional conservationists and say, go do good things with your land and with your money, and bridge that habitat that you have to other habitat somewhere, so that you can effectively create much larger ranges for animals. And you know, that's where the future is. The future is not in expanding the federal government and managing more lands. It's a non-starter.
So that makes for a nice segue to a future conversation about the future of land management, not necessarily public, but some creative version of land management. Thanks again for coming out this evening. We've got 2 more Politics and Pizza events scheduled for later in the semester. The next one is going to be on March 10th, and it'll be looking at the relationship between comedy and politics. So stay tuned for that. We've got some additional announcements of other events coming up before too long. So check out our Facebook page. Keep an eye on the Political Science Facebook page. Thanks for coming. Thanks to our panelists. Have a good evening. Thanks.